I still remember the smell of the testing chamber, that particular combination of machine oil, ozone, and the metallic tang of fear sweat that every candidate left behind on the examination bench. The administratum assessor never looked at my face, only at the data slate that catalogued my scores, my physical measurements, my psychological tolerances. When he stamped my assignment papers with the crimson seal of the Ordinatus division, I felt something like pride. They said bomb disposal was a calling, that the Emperor himself guided the hands of those who would shield his servants from the heretic's wrath. I believed them then. In that ferrocrete processing center 3 levels below the hive's commercial districts, where the air recyclers hummed their constant hymnal, and the fluorescent lumens cast everything in sickly green. I was young enough to think that skill mattered, that training would keep me alive, that the Imperium rewarded competence with survival. The first month was classroom instruction in a converted warehouse that still bore scorch marks from whatever manufactorum accident had claimed its previous occupants. Our instructor was a veteran named Vorskal, a man who had lost his left arm, his right eye, and most of his capacity for joy to various devices over his 30-year career. He walked between our desks with a clicking gait augmetic leg, they said, though the quality was poor enough that you could hear the grinding of inadequately lubricated joints. He taught us to read blast patterns in pict captures, to identify triggering mechanisms by their component silhouettes, to calculate shaped charge effects and fragmentation radii. The walls were decorated with diagrams of various ordnance types, cross-sections rendered in technical detail that somehow made them more terrifying rather than less. I learned that there were 743 distinct classifications of explosive devices in standard Imperial usage, and that heretics had invented at least 3,000 variations on these themes, each one a new way to end a life or destroy a prayer. Vorskal showed us recordings of failed disposals. The pict feeds were grainy, shot from servitor-mounted recorders that captured the final moments of bomb techs who had made errors in judgment or technique. We watched them approach devices in full blast armor, watched the careful movements of their hands, watched the sudden white flash that preceded static. Sometimes the servitor recording would survive, and we would see the aftermath, the crater, the scattered components, the pieces that had once been a person. He never told us their names, only their mistakes. Assumed a mercury switch when the device used a gyroscopic trigger, failed to identify a secondary charge, trusted shielding that was rated for 1 explosive yield when facing another, cut the wrong wire because the heretic artificer had reversed the standard color coding. Each lesson was a catalogue of death, and we were meant to memorize them all, to build within our minds a library of failure so complete that we would recognize every possible permutation of disaster before it claimed us. The practical training began in month 2, and that was when the dream started. They gave us inert devices, at first perfect replicas of live ordnance, but with the explosive elements replaced by weighted blocks. We learned to disassemble them in controlled environments, our hands shaking with manufactured adrenaline, knowing that in training a mistake meant failure marks, but in the field it meant obliteration. The blast armor they issued us was 3rd-generation Imperial standard, heavy ceramite plates over a mesh undersuit, with a reinforced helmet that limited peripheral vision and made breathing an exercise in conscious effort. Wearing it felt like being buried alive in a sarcophagus of false security. Vorskal told us the armor would protect us from shrapnel and concussive force up to a certain threshold, but anything above that threshold would liquefy us inside the shell, leaving the armor intact and the body within transformed into a slurry of meat and bone fragments. I excelled at the technical elements. My hands were steady, my mind capable of holding complex spatial relationships, my fear manageable enough that it sharpened rather than paralyzed me. The other candidates began to fail out one by one, some through inability to master the material, others through psychological breaks during the simulations, where they introduced time pressure and false intelligence, suggesting civilian casualties. One woman named Callis simply walked out during a practical examination, removed her helmet, set it carefully on the ground, and walked to the facility's exit where she requested reassignment to any other duty. They sent her to a penal legion, I heard later, because abandoning a specialized training program was categorized as dereliction regardless of the circumstances. The administratum had invested resources in her education, and the Imperium does not tolerate waste. By month 4, we were down to 7 candidates from an initial cohort of 30. They took us to a real bomb for the first time, a captured heretic device that had been successfully neutralized months prior and then carefully reassembled into an inert training aid. We stood in a circle around it while Vorskil lectured, his voice distorted through the Vox speakers in our helmets, pointing out the telltale signs of its construction. This one had been built by cultists in the Underhive, he said, using stolen industrial explosives and scavenged components from mining equipment. The triggering mechanism was a crude pressure plate, but they had added a secondary timer as backup and a tertiary anti-tamper device that would detonate if the casing was opened incorrectly. 3 separate systems, each one capable of killing us, each one requiring a different approach to neutralization. He made us examine it for an hour, studying every detail, before he allowed us to begin the disassembly process under his supervision. My turn came last, and I remember the feeling of my heartbeat accelerating as I knelt before the device, the armor making every movement ponderous and deliberate. The rest of the squad had moved back to the minimum safe distance, leaving me alone with the bomb and Vorskil's voice in my ear, providing instructions that felt both too detailed and not detailed enough. I used the portable Auspex scanner to verify what he had told us about the internal layout, watching the green wireframe representation build itself on the handheld display. Everything matched his description, which should have been reassuring but instead felt like the universe offering me false comfort before revealing some hidden complication. I removed the outer casing screws one by one, placing them in the numbered container slots they had taught us to use, maintaining accountability for every component because lost parts suggested tampering or device degradation. The moment I lifted the casing away and saw the actual explosives even inert, even safe, something changed in my understanding of my own mortality. This was perhaps 5 kilograms of material that, if live, would have erased me from existence before my nervous system could register the transition from being to nothingness. The wiring was visible now, a tangle of colored cables that followed no standard pattern, because heretics care nothing for the Omnissiah's ordained specifications. I used the cutters to sever the connections in the sequence Vorskil dictated, each snip producing a tiny sound that seemed magnified inside my helmet, each separation of circuit another step back from an imagined abyss. When I finally extracted the timing mechanism and placed it in the collection tray, Vorskil grunted something that might have been approval. I had passed the threshold from theory to practice, from student to technician, and with that passage came the understanding that I would now be expected to repeat this process with devices that could actually kill me. They deployed us 2 weeks later. The administratum didn't believe in extended graduation ceremonies or periods of adjustment. We were assigned to a bomb disposal unit serving the Hive's law enforcement apparatus, tasked with responding to threats both genuine and suspected. Our first deployment was a false alarm. Someone had reported a suspicious package in a mid-Hive commercial district, and we arrived in full armor to discover a forgotten shipment of autoquills that had been left outside a scribe office after the proprietor failed to sign for delivery. The crowd that had gathered to watch us work seemed disappointed when we declared the area safe, as though they had been hoping for spectacle. Vorskil had joined us as unit supervisor, and he reminded us during the transport ride back to the precinct that false alarms were a blessing, that every call we answered that turned out to be nothing was another day we remained alive. The real calls started accumulating after that, and with them came the understanding that our training had only scratched the surface of what we would face. The heretics in the underhive were apparently engaged in some kind of doctrinal war with each other, multiple sects of the Emperor's enemies competing for dominance through violence. They planted bombs in each other's gathering places, in the transit stations between levels, in the water reclamation facilities that everyone depended on regardless of faith or loyalty. We would receive vox calls in the middle of the night, scramble into our armor, board the armored transport, and descend into the hive's depths, where the air grew thick with industrial fumes and the crime of existing wrong-thoughted flourished in the absence of light. The first live device I encountered personally had been placed in a shrine dedicated to Saint Margessa, a small chapel carved into the hive wall, where the faithful gathered to pray for intercession in matters of disease and injury. Someone had hidden it beneath the altar, behind the reliquary containing what were purported to be the saint's finger bones. The local priest had discovered it during morning preparations, or rather had discovered the wire leading to it, and had possessed enough wisdom to evacuate his congregation before investigating further. We arrived to find him standing outside the shrine entrance, still wearing his ceremonial robes, his face pale with the understanding of how close he had come to annihilation. He blessed us before we entered, making the sign of the Aquila over our armored chests, and I felt no comfort from the gesture. The shrine interior was a cramped space, perhaps 10 meters square, with vaulted ceilings covered in amateur frescoes depicting the saint's martyrdom. The altar was simple ferrocrete, dressed in cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with age and incense smoke. I approached it alone while the rest of the unit maintained the perimeter, my breathing loud in my ears, the recycled air in my helmet tasting of rubber and fear. The device was exactly where the priest had described, a box roughly the size of a ration container, with wires visible where they connected to what appeared to be a vox receiver. A remote trigger, then, which meant someone nearby had the detonator, or had fled after planting it, or was waiting for maximum casualties before activating it. I used the Auspex scanner to examine the device through the altar's structure, watching the green lines trace out its internal components on my display. The explosive was military-grade, stolen or scavenged from some Imperial supply depot, enough to bring down the shrine's roof and kill anyone inside. The triggering mechanism was simpler than I had expected, just the Vox receiver connected to a battery and a blasting cap. No anti-tamper devices that I could detect, no backup timers, just a straightforward remote detonation system that relied on the operator activating it from a safe distance. I reported my findings to Vorskil over the Voxlink, and he authorized a standard neutralization approach. Disconnect the receiver from the power source, extract the blasting cap from the explosive, remove the device for controlled destruction. My hands were shaking as I reached beneath the altar, feeling for the device in the confined space, my armored fingers clumsy against the smooth surface of the box. The wires were visible when I angled my helmet light correctly, red and black cables leading from the receiver to the explosive's interior. I traced them visually, confirming what the Auspex had shown me, looking for any surprise element that might have been missed in the scan. There was nothing. Just a simple bomb, crude but effective, built by someone with basic technical knowledge and murderous intent. I used the insulated cutters to sever the power connection first, the tool's jaws closing on the wire with a decisive snip that made my heart stop for the fraction of a second before my brain registered that I was still alive. The receiver's indicator light went dark, confirming the circuit was broken. I extracted the blasting cap next, unscrewing it from its housing with careful rotations, conscious that friction could potentially generate enough heat to cause detonation even without electrical current. When I emerged from the shrine carrying the disarmed device in a containment bag, the priest fell to his knees and began praying, his voice rising in thanks to the Emperor and his saints. The crowd that had gathered beyond the security cordon applauded, a sound that reached me as distant noise through my helmet's audio dampening. Vorskil clapped me on the shoulder, his augmetic hand producing a hollow clang against my armor's ceramite plating. I felt nothing like triumph or relief, only a deep exhaustion that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond my physical body, as though the fear had burned through some reserve of spiritual energy that I would need to slowly replenish. We rendered that device safe at the precinct's demolition range, placing it in the containment sphere and detonating it remotely. The explosion was louder than I had expected, a sharp crack followed by a pressure wave that I could feel through the observation bunker's reinforced walls. That sound became a reference point for me, a baseline against which I measured all subsequent devices. This is the amount of explosive that could have killed me yesterday. This is the force that I prevented from being unleashed in a crowded shrine. This is the thing I will face again tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, until eventually my skill or luck fails, and the sound is the last thing my nervous system registers before dissolution. The calls came more frequently after that, as though the successful disarmament had somehow encouraged the heretics to plant more devices, or perhaps the Arbites had simply become more aggressive in their investigations and sweeps. We responded to threats in hab blocks, in food distribution centers, in the ventilation systems that supplied entire hive sections with breathable air. Each device was different. Each one, a puzzle built by someone who wanted to kill the maximum number of people with the resources available to them. I learned to read the signatures of different bomb makers, to recognize the patterns in their construction choices, to anticipate the kinds of tricks they might employ to defeat disposal attempts. Some favored simplicity and reliability, building straightforward devices that depended on quantity of explosive rather than sophistication of design. Others were artists of murder, creating elaborate mechanisms that seemed designed as much to kill the disposal technician as to achieve the broader goal of mass casualties. One of our unit members, a quiet man named Torrens, died 3 months into our deployment. He had been called to a device in an underhive gambling den, a place where the criminal elements gathered to waste their meager wages on games of chance that were rigged in the house's favor. Someone had planted a bomb in the establishment's ceiling, hidden among the tangle of power cables and water pipes that crossed overhead. Torrens had been examining it from a ladder, using his auspex to map the internal components, when something went wrong. The official report said he had inadvertently triggered a mercury switch, a pressure-sensitive mechanism that detected the change in orientation when he moved the device slightly while scanning. The unofficial truth, which Vorskil shared with us over Amasek in the unit's ready room, was that the device had been designed to be undetectable until moved, and that Torrens had done everything correctly according to protocol and training. Sometimes correct procedure still led to death, because the enemy was intelligent and adaptive, and willing to sacrifice multiple devices that were discovered safely in order to kill one technician who would let down his guard after too many successful disarmaments. They gave us Torrens' replacement 2 days after his memorial service, a young woman named Kessa who had just completed the training program that we had gone through months before. She looked at us with eyes that still held hope, that hadn't yet accumulated the weight of repeated close calls, and witnessed horrors. I wondered how long it would take for that light to fade, for her to develop the same haunted expression that I saw in my reflection when I passed by polished surfaces. Vorskil assigned her to shadow me on calls, learning the practical elements that couldn't be taught in classrooms, and I found myself in the uncomfortable position of mentor to someone who reminded me painfully of who I had been before the reality of this duty had worn away my illusions. Her first live device was a timing mechanism placed in a transit station, hidden in a trash receptacle where thousands of workers passed daily on their way between hive levels. The mechanism was crude but effective, an old chronometer connected to a battery, and enough explosive to collapse the station's roof supports. We had perhaps 20 minutes before detonation when we arrived, based on the chronometer's visible display, which meant no time for extensive analysis or consultation. Kessa stood behind me as I worked, her breathing audible over the Vox link, quick and shallow, with barely controlled panic. I talked her through each step as I performed it, forcing myself to maintain a calm tone even as my own hands betrayed my stress with minute tremors that I hoped she couldn't see through the armor's bulk. The chronometer was connected to the explosive through a simple relay, and I bypassed it by creating an alternate circuit path that isolated the timing mechanism before carefully disconnecting the power source. When the chronometer's display froze at 14 minutes and 37 seconds remaining, I heard Kessa exhale slowly, a sound that contained entire universes of relief and terror in roughly equal measure. The pattern of attacks shifted as the seasons progressed, though seasons meant little in the hive's eternal twilight. We tracked them through the administratum's calendar and the subtle changes in temperature that penetrated even the deep levels where we worked. The heretics had apparently acquired a new source of explosives, because the devices we encountered began incorporating military-grade materials that hadn't appeared in previous incidents. Vorskul reported this through proper channels, filing incident reports with the Arbites and the Adeptus Ministorum, but the Imperium's bureaucracy moved slowly, and we continued to face increasingly sophisticated threats while waiting for official response. The devices grew more complex, incorporating multiple triggering mechanisms and anti-tamper protections that required careful analysis and sometimes hours of patient work to neutralize. I began to dream about bombs during the few hours I managed to sleep between calls. In the dreams, I would be facing a device that seemed familiar, following procedures that I knew were correct, only to discover at the moment of detonation that I had overlooked some crucial detail, some variation on established patterns that proved fatal. I would wake in my quarters with my heart racing, my skin slick with sweat, unable to return to sleep because closing my eyes meant returning to the dreams. The unit's medical officer prescribed stimulants to keep me alert during duty hours and sedatives to force unconsciousness during rest periods, creating a pharmaceutical cycle that left me feeling disconnected from my own body, piloting it remotely through fog and chemical haze. Kessa lasted 6 months before her first real failure. We had been called to a suspected device in a Promethium refinery, a facility that processed raw fuel into the various grades required by the hive's endless machinery. The threat assessment suggested a device somewhere in the storage tank complex, an area where explosive force would be magnified catastrophically by the millions of liters of volatile fuel contained in the massive ferrocrete cylinders. We swept the complex methodically, using Auspex scanners to detect anomalous electronic signatures among the background noise of the refinery's operational equipment. Kessa found it first. Her scanner registered the distinctive pattern of a timing mechanism tucked into the gap between 2 storage tanks, accessible only through a narrow maintenance corridor. She volunteered to make the approach, perhaps wanting to prove herself after months of watching others take the primary risks. Vorskul approved it, and I followed her as backup, crawling through the corridor on our hands and knees because the space was too confined for standing. The device was exactly where her scanner had indicated, a box wrapped in what appeared to be standard insulation material, with wires visible at one edge. She began her examination protocol, scanning it carefully, reporting her findings over the Vox link to Vorskul, who monitored from the command position. Everything seemed routine until she shifted her position slightly and the Auspex display flickered, its readout changing to show components that hadn't been visible in the initial scan. I saw her freeze, saw the way her armored body went rigid with the understanding that the device was more complex than it had initially appeared. She started to back away slowly, following the procedure for suspected anti-tamper mechanisms, when the device emitted a soft clicking sound that meant activation of a mechanical trigger. I grabbed her armored leg and pulled, dragging her back down the maintenance corridor, with strength born of pure adrenaline and terror, my own body moving on instinct rather than conscious thought. We cleared the corridor approximately 3 seconds before the device detonated, the blast channeled by the space's configuration into a directed force that would have killed both of us instantly if we had remained in its path. The storage tanks held, their construction sufficiently robust to contain the explosion, but the maintenance corridor was transformed into a scorched tunnel of twisted metal and melted composite materials. Kessa didn't speak for 2 days after that incident, responding to questions with nods or headshakes, performing her duties with mechanical precision, but empty eyes. When she finally broke her silence, it was to tell me that she had known something was wrong, that the device had felt different, somehow in a way she couldn't articulate, but that she had doubted her own instincts and proceeded anyway. I told her that survival meant learning to trust those wordless warnings, that our training and technical knowledge could only carry us so far, but that the margin between life and death often came down to heeding the primitive alarm systems built into our nervous systems. She nodded, but I could see that the lesson had carved itself into her psyche, at a depth that no amount of classroom instruction could reach. She had learned what Torrens had learned too late, that this duty was not a career, but a slow execution, a daily lottery where skill and caution only improved the odds slightly against an eventual outcome that was functionally certain. The unit's character changed after that incident. We had all been frightened before, all conscious of mortality, but there had been a kind of professional distance that we maintained, a collective fiction that proper procedure and careful work would keep us safe. Kessa's near death stripped away that fiction, left us facing the naked truth that some devices were built specifically to kill the disposal technician, and that no amount of skill could guarantee survival against an enemy who was willing to sacrifice expensive explosives and complex mechanisms just to claim one more servant of the Emperor. We grew quieter during transport rides, less inclined to the dark humor that soldiers use to manage fear. Each call became heavier, freighted with the knowledge that this could be the one where our luck finally exhausted itself. The nightmares intensified during this period, becoming more vivid and harder to shake off after waking. I began to see the faces of the people who would die if I failed, imagining them in the moments before detonation, workers going about their duties, pilgrims offering prayers, children who had the misfortune of being present when someone else's ideology demanded blood sacrifice. The stimulants and sedatives lost their effectiveness, requiring increased dosages to produce the same results, until the medical officer warned me that I was approaching dangerous thresholds and needed to request relief from duty before I became a liability. I nodded and thanked him and made no such request, because requesting relief meant admitting failure, and admitting failure meant dishonoring those who had died in this duty, and dishonoring the dead meant I had wasted whatever time remained to me before joining them. We lost another unit member during a routine call to a suspected device in a water treatment facility. His name was Grest, a veteran who had been performing this duty since before I completed primary instruction, and he died because he trusted his experience too much, assumed that a device displaying certain characteristics would behave according to patterns he had seen dozens of times before. The device proved to be a hybrid design, combining elements from multiple construction philosophies, and when he attempted to disconnect what he believed was the primary trigger, he activated a secondary mechanism that he had not anticipated. The blast killed him instantly, or so the official report stated, though those of us who watched the picked feed recording knew he had lived for several seconds after detonation, his body torn apart by the explosion, but his augmented heart still attempting to pump blood through a circulatory system that no longer existed in complete form. They replaced Grest with a man named Hulk, another recent graduate from the training program, and I watched Kessa begin the same process of mentorship that I had provided her months before. The unit was cycling through members at a rate that seemed unsustainable, but the administratum continued to train new disposal technicians and deploy them into active duty because the need for this service never diminished, and the alternative, leaving devices to detonate unchallenged, was strategically unacceptable. I understood then that we were not truly expected to survive, that the training program was not designed to produce long-serving veterans but rather to create a stream of replaceable specialists who would each perform the duty until chance or enemy sophistication claimed them, at which point another would take their place in an endless procession of sacrifice. The administrative burden increased alongside the operational demands. Each device required extensive documentation, picked captures from multiple angles, detailed descriptions of construction and components, analysis of triggering mechanisms, and defeat procedures. The administratum wanted this information for their archives, building databases that would supposedly help future technicians identify and neutralize threats more efficiently. I spent hours in the precinct's record room, filing reports and updating case files, trying to capture in dry technical language the visceral reality of confronting explosive devices that had been lovingly crafted by people who wanted me and those I protected to die screaming. The reports felt like prayers in reverse, offerings to an uncaring bureaucracy that would consume them and produce no redemption or salvation in return. Vorskal's health began to decline visibly around this time. His remaining organic eye developed a constant twitch, and his speech became increasingly punctuated by long pauses where he seemed to be searching for words that had once come naturally. The augmetic parts of his body required more frequent maintenance, their servos grinding louder and their joints moving less smoothly despite the tech priest's ministrations. He started making mistakes in his supervisory duties, nothing catastrophic, but small errors of judgment or memory that suggested his mind was fragmenting under accumulated stress. The administratum should have rotated him out, assigned him to training duties or administrative positions where the pressure was less immediate, but they needed experienced supervisors in the field, and so he remained with us, slowly breaking down like a machine running past its designed operational lifespan. A new pattern emerged in the devices we encountered, one that Vorskal identified as particularly troubling. The heretics had apparently been studying our disposal techniques, learning from their failures, adapting their designs to counter our standard procedures. Devices began appearing with what he called technician traps, mechanisms specifically designed to target the expected behavior of bomb disposal specialists. A device might be constructed to appear simple and straightforward, inviting a standard disarmament approach, but contain hidden elements that would detonate when those standard procedures were followed. Or a device might incorporate legitimate safety features that seemed designed to prevent accidental detonation, but were actually triggers waiting for a disposal technician to interact with them in the expected manner. We adapted in turn, developing new protocols and approaches, but the adaptation came at the cost of increased time per device and greater cognitive load during disposal attempts. Each device now required not just technical analysis, but also psychological analysis, attempting to understand the bomb maker's intent, to model their thinking, to anticipate the ways they might have predicted our responses. This transformation of the duty from technical problem-solving to a kind of lethal chess match with an absent opponent wore on us in ways that physical danger alone had not. It was no longer sufficient to be skilled and careful. We also needed to think like heretics, to inhabit the mindset of those who built murder devices, and that mental occupation left stains that no amount of prayer or meditation could fully cleanse. Kessa began showing signs of the same deterioration I had experienced earlier. She lost weight, her face becoming gaunt behind the helmet's visor, her movements taking on the jerky quality of someone running on stimulants and willpower rather than actual rest. I tried to speak with her about it, to offer the counsel that the medical officer had given me, but she dismissed my concerns with the same reasoning I had used when refusing to request relief. We were trapped in a duty that none of us believed we would survive, but from which none of us could escape without dishonor or reassignment to fates potentially worse than our current circumstance. The Imperium's machinery had processed us into this specialized function, and we would continue to perform it until death or permanent injury rendered us incapable, at which point the machinery would select new candidates and begin the process again. The worst call I experienced personally came on a day that had begun no differently than any other. We received notification of a suspicious package in a mid-hive skolum, a facility where young citizens receive their basic instruction in reading, mathematics, and proper veneration of the Emperor. The package had been discovered by a janitor during routine cleaning, left in a storage closet adjacent to one of the larger classrooms, where hundreds of children gathered daily for lessons. The timing suggested deliberate malice. It was found early in the morning, before students arrived, but the bomb maker had likely intended it to detonate during school hours for maximum psychological impact. I made the approach alone, Vorskal having decided that the confined space and location near so many innocent lives justified minimizing the number of personnel at risk. The skolum had been evacuated, its hallways empty and silent, except for my armored footsteps and the whisper of the ventilation system. The storage closet was exactly as described in the initial report, a narrow space filled with cleaning supplies and educational materials, with the suspicious package sitting on a middle shelf, wrapped in plain brown paper like a delivery that someone had forgotten to collect. My Auspex scanner showed the now familiar signature of explosives and electronic components, but the scan resolution was insufficient to give me a complete picture of the device's internal construction due to the shielding effect of the surrounding objects. I cleared the space carefully, removing shelves and supplies to create working room, conscious that any vibration or disturbance might trigger the device if it incorporated motion-sensitive mechanisms. The package itself was heavier than expected when I finally had clear access to it, suggesting either dense, explosive material or the presence of additional components beyond what the Auspex had detected. I used my cutters to carefully open the paper wrapping, peeling it back layer by layer, revealing a metal box underneath that bore no identifying marks or labels. The box was locked with a simple combination mechanism, the kind used on personal storage containers, which immediately suggested anti-tamper protection. The lock itself might be the trigger, requiring a specific combination to open safely or detonating if forced. I reported my findings to Vorskal over the Vox link, describing what I was seeing in careful detail, waiting for his authorization to proceed with the next stage of examination. There was a longer pause than usual before he responded, and when he did, his voice carried a quality I hadn't heard before, something that might have been resignation or perhaps acceptance. He told me to withdraw from the building, that he was calling for a specialized demolition team to handle this device, that the risk profile was too high for standard disposal protocols. I acknowledged his order and began backing away from the closet, my movements slow and deliberate, conscious that I had just spent several minutes in intimate proximity with a device that might detonate at any moment. I was halfway down the skolum's main corridor when the device exploded. The blast came from behind me, a wall of pressure and noise that picked me up and threw me forward like a child discarding a broken toy. My armor absorbed most of the force, its ceramite plates cracking under the impact but holding together, preventing the shrapnel and debris from penetrating to my flesh. I landed badly, my left leg twisting beneath me, pain shooting up through my knee and hip in waves that threatened to overwhelm my consciousness. The corridor was filled with smoke and dust, the air thick with particulates that my helmet's filters struggled to process. I could hear alarms wailing in the distance, and closer, the sound of structural damage, creaking metal and falling debris as the blast's effects propagated through the building's frame. Vorskel's voice came through my helmet's speakers, distorted by interference but urgent, demanding to know my status. I managed to respond that I was alive, injured but mobile, that the device had detonated while I was withdrawing. He told me to evacuate immediately, that the building's structural integrity was compromised, that rescue personnel were on approach, but I needed to reach them rather than waiting for extraction. I forced myself to stand, testing my injured leg, finding that it would bear weight if I kept most of my mass on the uninjured side. The corridor's emergency lighting had activated, casting everything in red illumination that turned the smoke into a hellish fog. I limped toward the exit, my progress agonizingly slow, each step sending fresh lances of pain through my damaged leg. The building groaned around me, ferrocrete and metal adjusting to the new stresses introduced by the blast. I passed classrooms that would have been filled with children in a few hours, their walls now cracked and their windows shattered by the explosion's pressure wave. The device had been large enough to collapse several interior walls and damage the building's support structure, which meant that if it had detonated during school hours, the casualties would have been catastrophic. I had failed to neutralize it, had failed in the primary duty I had been assigned, but at least I had failed in a way that prevented the heretics' intended massacre. The medical bay at the precinct was where I learned the extent of my injuries. The leg was badly damaged, torn ligaments, cracked bones, damage to the knee joint that would require augmetic replacement if I wanted to continue field duty. The blast had also caused internal injuries, hemorrhaging in my torso that required immediate surgery to repair. The Medicae servitors worked on me with mechanical efficiency, their specialized instruments cutting and stitching according to programmed patterns while I lay sedated, my consciousness floating in a chemical haze that muted but did not eliminate the pain. When I woke properly, Vorskul was sitting beside my medical cot, his remaining eye fixed on my face, with an expression that might have been sympathy or perhaps envy, that I had legitimate reason to request relief from active duty. He told me that the bomb had been designed to detonate on withdrawal rather than approach, a new sophistication that suggested the heretics were learning faster than we could adapt. The delay timer had apparently been set to allow sufficient time for a disposal technician to reach the device and begin examination before triggering the detonation sequence. If I had been slower in my response to his withdrawal order, or if he had delayed giving that order by even a few seconds, I would have been close enough to the epicenter that my armor's protection would have been insufficient. I had survived through a combination of discipline, Vorskul's judgment, and margins so narrow that they approached the width of a decision delayed by a single heartbeat. The recovery period lasted 3 months, during which I was assigned to administrative duties that kept me at the precinct, reviewing reports and updating databases while my body healed, and the tech priests fabricated the augmetic components that would replace my damaged leg. I watched the unit continue their work without me, saw the reports come in documenting successful disposals and failed attempts, learned the names of new members who replaced those who had died while I convalesced. Kessa survived those months, as did Hulk, though both accumulated minor injuries and psychological scars that manifested in the hollow way they moved and spoke when they returned from calls. Vorskul grew increasingly unstable, his pauses during briefings lengthening into full dissociative episodes where he would stop speaking mid-sentence and stare at nothing, his mind apparently traveling to some place that the rest of us could not follow. The augmetic integration was more difficult than the Medicae had suggested it would be. The leg they gave me was functional but crude, a design meant for workers and soldiers rather than specialists, its servos loud and its movement patterns not quite matching the organic rhythm of my remaining limb. I spent weeks in physical therapy, learning to walk again, training my nervous system to accept the machine parts as extensions of my body rather than foreign objects to be rejected. The join point where metal met flesh was a constant source of discomfort, not quite pain but an awareness of wrongness, a reminder every moment that I had been damaged and repaired in ways that left me lesser than I had been. They cleared me for return to active duty on a day when winter rain was falling on the hive's upper levels, precipitation that would never reach the depths where we worked, but that registered on weather reports as a statistical notation. I reported to the ready room and found that the unit had changed significantly in my absence. Vorskul was gone, retired on medical grounds after a complete psychological break during a disposal attempt, had left him catatonic for 6 hours. His replacement was a woman named Drex, younger than he had been, with an augmetic jaw that clicked when she spoke, and eyes that suggested she had seen enough death to understand what this duty entailed. Kessa was still present, though she looked years older than when I had left, her hair showing grey streaks that hadn't existed before. Several faces were new, recent graduates from the training program, their expressions carrying the same mixture of determination and poorly concealed fear that I remembered from my own early days. The first call after my return was to a device in an industrial complex, hidden among the machinery where workers toiled to produce components for the hive's endless construction and maintenance needs. The device was sophisticated, incorporating multiple false indicators designed to mislead disposal technicians about its true nature and trigger mechanisms. I approached it with my augmetic leg humming and clicking, my movements changed by the machine parts, my perspective altered by the months away from direct exposure to this particular flavor of terror. Something had changed in me during the recovery period. Some reserve of emotional response exhausted, or perhaps simply cauterized by too much fear compressed into too short a time. I examined the device with detached interest, following procedures mechanically, executing disposal protocols without the accompanying internal experience of stress that had previously accompanied such work. Drex noticed the change and commented on it after we had successfully neutralized the device and returned to the precinct. She asked if I was experiencing dissociation, if I needed to speak with the unit's psychological counselor, if my recent injury had left me with some form of trauma response that was interfering with my capacity to properly assess risk. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that I felt disconnected from my own fear, in a way that was unfamiliar but not necessarily unpleasant, that the work felt easier when approached as purely technical problem-solving without the emotional weight I had previously attached to it. She seemed uncertain whether this represented adaptive resilience or dangerous instability, but she cleared me to continue field operations while noting in my file that I required ongoing psychological evaluation. The pattern of my dreams changed after that conversation. Instead of nightmares about devices detonating, I began dreaming about becoming a device myself. My body transformed into a mechanism of destruction, ticking toward inevitable detonation, while retaining enough consciousness to understand what I had become. I would wake from these dreams with the certainty that they represented truth rather than symbolism, that we were all of us explosive devices waiting for the moment of activation, that the Imperium had wound us up and pointed us at its enemies, and that we would serve until we detonated, or were disarmed, or simply ran down like clockwork mechanisms that had exhausted their spring tension. The unit's casualty rate remained steady, approximately 1 death every 2 to 3 months, each loss followed by a brief memorial service and the arrival of a replacement who would serve until they too were claimed by the duty. I attended these services when I could, standing in the precinct's small chapel while a priest recited the standard prayers for the faithful dead, watching the faces of the other unit members to see who would be next. There was a randomness to the selection that made no allowance for skill or caution or years of experience. Veterans died from devices that should have been routine, while new technicians somehow survived encounters that should have killed them. The only consistent factor was that eventually everyone's luck failed. Eventually everyone made the mistake or encountered the device that was beyond their capacity to neutralize, and when that happened, the Imperium simply filed the appropriate paperwork and processed another candidate into their position. Kessa died on a cool morning 6 months after my return to duty. The call was to a device in a transit hub, one of the major junctions where crowds gathered to move between hive levels and districts. The device had been reported by a sanitation worker who noticed an unusual package attached to the underside of a transit platform, held in place with industrial adhesive and wired to what appeared to be a Vox receiver. Kessa volunteered to take primary position on the disposal, perhaps feeling that her experience entitled her to face the risk, rather than passing it to newer unit members. I went with her as backup, the two of us approaching the platform in full armor, while Drex coordinated from the command position and the Arbites maintained a security perimeter that kept civilians away from the potential blast radius. The device was exactly as reported, a box roughly 30 centimeters on each side, mounted to the platform's understructure in a location that would have been invisible to casual observation, but optimally positioned to direct explosive force upward into the crowd that would gather on the platform's SS surface. Kessa positioned herself beneath it, working in the confined space, while I monitored her progress and maintained communications with Drex. The initial examination went smoothly, her Auspex scan revealing a straightforward configuration: Vox receiver, battery, blasting cap, military-grade explosive. She began the neutralization process, disconnecting the receiver from its power source, extracting the blasting cap, preparing to remove the explosive package for transport to the demolition range. The error came in a moment of inattention or perhaps overconfidence born from too many successful disposals. As she shifted her position to get better access to the mounting adhesive, her armored shoulder brushed against the underside of the platform, producing a vibration that propagated through the structure. The device detonated immediately, not from the Vox receiver that we had neutralized, but from a secondary trigger that her Auspex scan had somehow missed, or that had been shielded in a way that prevented detection. The blast was confined somewhat by the platform's structure, directing most of its force downward rather than up into the area where crowds would have gathered, but Kessa was in the center of that downward-directed explosion, and her armor, despite its ceramite construction and reinforcement, could not protect her from force applied at such close range. I was far enough back that the blast didn't kill me, though it threw me against the transit hub's wall with enough force to crack several ribs and leave me stunned and gasping inside my helmet. When I recovered enough to move, I crawled to where Kessa had been, though I already knew what I would find. Her armor had been torn apart, the ceramite plates shattered like pottery, the components inside reduced to fragments. There was no body to recover in any meaningful sense, only pieces that would need to be collected for cremation and the standard memorial service that would follow within the week. I knelt there in the debris, my damaged ribs sending pain through my torso with each breath, and understood that the disconnection I had felt since my own injury was not resilience, but rather the early stage of a longer deterioration that would eventually consume whatever remained of the person I had been before joining this duty. They gave me a commendation for remaining at the scene until the Arbites arrived to secure it, though staying had been less choice than inability to move immediately. The medical bay treated my broken ribs with the same efficient indifference they had shown during my previous visit, wrapping my torso in support bandages and prescribing pain medications that added new chemicals to the cocktail I was already consuming to manage sleep and wakefulness. Drex visited me during recovery, bringing news that the device had incorporated a pressure-sensitive trigger in addition to the Vox receiver mechanism, and that Kessa's scan had failed to detect it because the trigger had been shielded with materials specifically designed to defeat Auspex examination. The heretics were evolving faster than we were, developing new techniques and technologies, while we continued to use the same equipment and procedures that had been standard for decades. I returned to duty 2 weeks later, my ribs still healing but sufficiently stable that I could perform basic functions. The unit had 2 new members now, replacing both Kessa and another technician named Voss, who had died while I was recovering from my injuries. The new technicians looked at me with a mixture of respect and fear, seeing in my augmetic leg and scarred face a preview of their own likely futures. I tried to offer them the wisdom that Vorskul had shared with us, the accumulated lessons of those who had died in this duty, but I could hear the hollowness in my own voice, the absence of conviction that had once accompanied such instruction. We were all of us teaching each other how to die slightly less quickly, passing down techniques that might extend survival by days or weeks, but that could not prevent the inevitable outcome that waited at the end of this duty's trajectory. The calls continued, an endless stream of threats and suspected threats, each one requiring response, each one carrying the possibility of being the last thing we would experience before transition from life to death to bureaucratic notation. I lost track of the number of devices I examined, the number of times I knelt before explosive mechanisms and worked to defeat them, while my heart raced and my hands trembled, and some distant part of my mind wondered whether this would be the moment when my skill or luck finally failed. The work became automatic, my body executing procedures, while my consciousness seemed to float somewhere above and behind, observing but not fully inhabiting the experience. Drex began showing signs of the same deterioration that had claimed Vorskal, her speech developing pauses, her hands developing tremors that she tried to conceal. The administratum should have rotated her out, should have recognized that supervisors in this duty suffered psychological damage at rates comparable to the technicians themselves, but the need for experienced leadership apparently outweighed concerns about mental stability. She continued to coordinate our operations, continued to make the decisions about who would approach which devices, continued to file the reports that documented our successes and failures, all while slowly fragmenting into someone less coherent and more haunted than the confident woman who had replaced Vorskal months before. I began to understand during this period that the purpose of our unit was not actually to neutralize all threats, but rather to serve as a kind of ritualized sacrifice, a demonstration of the Imperium's commitment to protecting its citizens, while accepting that some protection came at the cost of those who provided it. We were performing theater as much as actual bomb disposal, each successful neutralization a small propaganda victory that could be reported through official channels, each death a martyrdom that reinforced the narrative of constant struggle against the Emperor's enemies. The devices would continue to be planted regardless of our efforts. The heretics would continue to evolve their techniques, and we would continue to face them until we died, or became too damaged to continue, at which point we would be replaced by new candidates who would repeat the cycle. The recognition of this truth was strangely liberating. If the outcome was predetermined, if survival was not actually possible in the long term, then the fear that had consumed so much of my energy was revealed as wasted effort. I began to approach devices with something approaching curiosity rather than terror, examining them as though they were puzzles to be solved rather than threats to be survived. This shift in perspective made me more effective in some ways. I could think more clearly without the constant background noise of fear, could analyze mechanisms more objectively when I wasn't simultaneously imagining my own death. But it also left me disconnected from the basic self-preservation instincts that had kept me cautious, made me willing to take risks that a healthier person would have recognized as excessive. Drex noticed the change and tried to speak with me about it, her words slurred slightly by whatever medications she was taking to manage her own declining mental state. She told me that detachment was a warning sign, that technicians who stopped feeling appropriate fear often died shortly afterward because they lost the edge of caution that made the difference in marginal situations. I thanked her for the concern and told her I understood the risk, but we both knew that I would continue as I was, because the alternative, returning to the fear and stress that had characterized my earlier service, felt impossible, like trying to unlearn a truth once understood. The unit cycled through several more members during the months that followed. New faces appeared at briefings, learned the basics of our work, went on a few calls, and then either died or requested transfer to other duties, or simply broke down psychologically and were medically retired. I became a strange kind of veteran, not through exceptional skill or particularly long service, but through the simple fact of surviving when so many others had not. The newer technicians sought me out for advice, and I gave it to them, though I could see in their eyes that they recognized the deadness in my own, that they understood I was offering wisdom from a place beyond hope or fear. and that such wisdom might be accurate but was also deeply unsettling. I began having periods of lost time, gaps in my memory, where I would find myself in locations without clear recollection of having traveled there. The medical officer diagnosed this as a form of dissociative disorder, common among those who experienced repeated trauma, and adjusted my medication regimen again. The new prescriptions helped somewhat, reducing the frequency of the episodes, but they also left me feeling even more remote from my own experience, as though I were operating my body through a thick layer of chemical insulation that muffled all sensory input and emotional response. The devices themselves grew more elaborate during this period, or perhaps I simply became more aware of their complexity as my technical knowledge deepened through accumulated experience. We encountered mechanisms that incorporated biological elements, living components that registered as inert to our Auspex scanners because they produced no electronic signature. We found devices that used pressure-sensitive fluids or gases, mechanisms that would detonate if the ambient temperature changed beyond certain thresholds, triggers that relied on radiation or magnetic fields, or the subtle vibrations produced by human movement. Each new innovation represented both a threat and a kind of perverse admiration for the creativity of those who built these things, the way they adapted and evolved to counter our defensive measures. I killed a man during this period, though indirectly and unintentionally. We had been called to a device in a residential hab block, a suspected bomb that had been reported by a neighbor who noticed unusual activity in the apartment next door. When we arrived and breached the apartment door, we found an active bomb-making operation, workbenches covered in components, partially assembled devices, chemical precursors stored in inadequate containers that would likely have exploded on their own within days. The operator was still present, a thin man with burn scars on his hands and a look of resignation on his face when he saw us enter in full armor. He reached for something on his workbench, perhaps a detonator or perhaps just a tool, and I shot him without conscious decision, my weapon raised and fired before my mind had fully processed the threat. He fell, blood spreading from the last wound in his chest, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, while his breathing became increasingly labored and then stopped. The Arbites commended me for preventing potential detonation, for neutralizing the threat before the heretic could activate whatever devices he had been constructing. They found enough explosive material in his apartment to level several floors of the hab block, enough components to build dozens of bombs, evidence of planning for attacks that would have killed hundreds of civilians. I accepted the commendation and filed the required reports, and said nothing about how the act of killing had felt easier than I expected, how the trigger pull had been mechanical rather than emotional, how I felt nothing afterward except mild curiosity about why there was no guilt or horror accompanying what should have been a significant moral event. The disconnection was complete now, I understood. I had become a tool, a mechanism that responded to threats according to programmed parameters, and the loss of whatever humanity had once caused me to hesitate or feel remorse seemed neither good nor bad but simply factual. Drex died 3 months after that incident, not from a device but from the accumulated stress of coordinating disposal operations. She suffered a major organ failure during a routine briefing, her augmented heart simply stopping despite the tech priest's best efforts at maintenance and repair. They found during the autopsy that her cardiovascular system had been compromised by years of elevated stress hormones, that her body had been operating in a state of constant emergency that had gradually damaged tissues and organs beyond the point where augmetic repairs could compensate. The administratum filed this as death in service, which entitled her to the same memorial service and posthumous honors as those who died from explosive devices, though I suspect she would have found bitter humor in the idea that the duty had killed her without requiring actual exposure to bombs. Her replacement was a man named Korsk, older than Drex had been, with grey in his hair and a prosthetic eye that tracked movements with mechanical precision. He had served in this duty before, years ago, and had been retired after a device detonation left him with injuries severe enough to justify separation from active service. But the Imperium's need for experienced supervisors apparently outweighed concerns about his fitness for duty, and so he had been recalled and assigned to our unit, bringing with him both valuable knowledge and a visible example of how this duty consumed everyone it touched. His presence was simultaneously reassuring and deeply disturbing. Reassuring because his experience meant better coordination and decision-making, disturbing because he represented confirmation that there was no escape from this duty, that even medical retirement could be revoked if the administratum decided your service was still required. The character of the devices changed again during Kursk's tenure, incorporating elements that suggested the heretics had access to new resources or technical knowledge. We began encountering mechanisms that used exotic materials, components that our Auspex scanners couldn't properly analyze, triggering systems that seemed to operate on principles we didn't fully understand. Kursk recognized some of these elements from his previous service, was able to provide historical context about how similar devices had been handled decades before, but even he admitted that the sophistication level had increased substantially since his earlier deployment. The heretics were learning faster than the Imperium could adapt, were accessing knowledge or materials that suggested organization and resources beyond what typical underhive cult networks should possess. The Inquisition took an interest in our operations during this period, sending representatives to review our incident reports and examine the devices we had captured intact. These were frightening men and women, wearing the seal of their office openly, accompanied by servitors whose augmentations went far beyond anything I had seen in standard Imperial service. They asked detailed questions about the devices we had encountered, wanted to know about patterns in timing and placement, demanded access to our preserved components and analysis reports. Kursk cooperated fully, as one did when the Inquisition made requests, but I could see the concern in his face during and after these interviews. Inquisitorial involvement suggested that the bombing campaign was not simply a law enforcement problem but rather something more serious, perhaps evidence of organized heretical activity at a scale that required investigation by those charged with defending against existential threats to the Imperium itself. The Inquisition's presence changed the unit's dynamics in subtle ways. We knew now that our work was being scrutinized at the highest levels, that our successes and failures were being evaluated not just by local Arbeits commanders, but by individuals who held the authority to destroy entire worlds if they judged such action necessary. The pressure intensified, even as the actual duty remained unchanged. We still responded to the same calls, still examined the same devices, still worked to neutralize them using the same techniques and equipment. But now every action carried additional weight. Every report filed needed to meet standards of detail and accuracy beyond what had been previously expected. I began to have moments of clarity during this period, brief windows where the chemical insulation would thin and I would experience something like my original emotional responses to the duty. These moments were intensely unpleasant, filled with sudden acute awareness of all the accumulated trauma and fear that I had been suppressing through disconnection and medication. During these windows I would understand viscerally that I was dying slowly, that this duty was consuming me piece by piece, that I had perhaps months or at most a year before I either died from a device or broke down completely and joined Vorskal and Drex in whatever medical facilities the Imperium maintained for those who had served past their psychological destruction point. Then the moment would pass, the medications would reassert their effect, and I would return to the comfortable numbness that had become my default state. The end came on a day that began with morning prayers in the precinct's chapel, routine devotions offered to the Emperor by those about to face another day of confronting heretical threats. I knelt among the other unit members, reciting the familiar words, my augmetic leg humming softly as its servos adjusted to maintain my position. Kursk led the prayers, his mechanical eye clicking as it moved to scan our faces, perhaps assessing our readiness, or perhaps simply performing the ceremonial duty expected of a unit supervisor. The priest blessed us with the sign of the Aquila and dismissed us to our duties, and we filed out of the chapel toward the ready room, where we would await the inevitable call. It came an hour later, a report of a device in one of the hive's primary water distribution facilities, a location critical enough that its destruction would affect millions of citizens in the levels below. The threat assessment suggested a large explosive package, professionally constructed, placed in a location that would maximize both immediate damage and long-term disruption. Kursk designated me as primary for the disposal attempt, perhaps because my experience and emotional disconnection made me the most suitable candidate, perhaps because he had reviewed my file and concluded that I was approaching the end of my useful service, and this represented an appropriate final assignment. I accepted the designation without comment, suited up in my armor, and boarded the transport for the journey to the facility. The water distribution center was a massive complex of pipes and pumps and filtration systems, all working constantly to process and deliver the liquid that kept the hive's population alive. The device had been placed in a central nexus point, where damage would affect multiple distribution lines simultaneously. The facility's tech priests had evacuated all personnel and shut down the pumping systems to minimize potential for contamination if the explosive device was constructed using chemical or biological agents. The resulting silence was profound and eerie. This space that normally thundered with industrial activity now quiet, except for the distant drip of water and the hum of emergency lighting. I approached the device alone, following the coordinates provided by the facility staff, moving through corridors lined with massive pipes that carried water to hab blocks and factories and shrine temples. The device was in a large chamber at the facility's heart, surrounded by the primary distribution valves that controlled flow to entire hive sections. It was larger than I expected, a container perhaps 2 meters long and half that in width and height, covered in warning symbols that seemed designed to taunt the disposal technician who would eventually confront it. The symbols were in High Gothic, phrases declaring devotion to powers that the Imperium classified as enemies of mankind, decorative elements that transformed the device from simple explosive mechanism into theological statement. My Auspex examination revealed complexity beyond anything I had encountered before. Multiple triggering systems, each one redundant and independent, each one incorporating elements that would defeat standard neutralization approaches. The device was a masterwork of destructive engineering, built by someone with extensive knowledge of Imperial bomb disposal procedures and access to materials that suggested supply chains far more sophisticated than typical cult operations. I reported my findings to Kursk, describing in detail what I was seeing, knowing that these observations would be recorded and analyzed by the Inquisition regardless of the disposal's outcome. Kursk was silent for a long moment after I finished my report, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality I hadn't heard from him before, something that might have been sadness or perhaps acceptance. He told me that the Inquisition's representatives were present at the command position, that they were monitoring my examination, that they had indicated this device was connected to a broader investigation they were conducting. He told me to proceed with extreme caution, to prioritize gathering information about the device's construction, even if that meant extending the time I spent in proximity to it, to understand that my safety was secondary to the intelligence value this device represented. I acknowledged his instructions and began the most careful examination I had ever performed, using every technique I had learned, every tool at my disposal, documenting the device with picked captures and detailed verbal descriptions. The work was meditative in its intensity, requiring absolute concentration, and somewhere during the process, the emotional disconnection that had characterized my recent service began to dissolve. I became aware again of fear, real and immediate, the understanding that I was kneeling before something designed to kill me that the skills and training that had kept me alive thus far might not be sufficient against this particular threat. The awareness brought clarity, sharpening my perceptions, burning away the chemical fog that had insulated me from my own experience. The device incorporated elements that I recognized from multiple previous incidents, components that suggested the same bomb maker or group of makers had been responsible for many of the devices our unit had encountered over the past year. This was confirmation of what the Inquisition had apparently already suspected, that the bombing campaign was not the work of disconnected cult cells, but rather a coordinated effort by an organized enemy, someone or some group with resources and patience sufficient to conduct sustained operations against the Imperium's infrastructure. The implications were troubling beyond the immediate threat of the device before me, suggesting that the Hive's authorities had been fighting symptoms rather than addressing the actual disease, that the enemy was more capable and more dangerous than anyone had wanted to acknowledge. I continued my examination for hours, working until my arms ached and my augmetic leg's power cell was depleted enough to trigger warning indicators. Kursk called for me to withdraw periodically, offering opportunities to rest and recharge, but I refused, understanding somehow that if I left this chamber, I would not be able to force myself to return, that whatever reserve of will was allowing me to function in proximity to this device would evaporate once I broke concentration. The device's complexity gradually revealed itself through patient analysis, showing me the elegant and terrible logic of its construction, the way each system supported and protected the others, the way the bomb maker had anticipated and countered the disposal approaches that a technician would naturally attempt. I found the key to neutralization finally. After perhaps 6 hours of continuous examination, a sequence of actions that would disable the triggering mechanisms without activating the fail-safes that would cause immediate detonation. The sequence was complex and would require perfect execution, each action performed in correct order and correct timing. No room for error or hesitation. I described the approach to Kursk in detail, outlining each step, waiting for his authorization to proceed, or his order to withdraw, so that a demolition team could simply destroy the facility and the device together, accepting the collateral damage in exchange for certainty of neutralization. The Inquisition's representatives apparently had other priorities, because Kursk returned after consultation with them to authorize my approach, to tell me to proceed with the neutralization attempt, that the device must be preserved, if possible, for further analysis, that I should take whatever risks were necessary to achieve this objective. I understood then that I had been designated as expendable, that the Inquisition had calculated that the intelligence value of an intact device was worth the risk of my death, that if I failed, the only consequence from their perspective would be the loss of one disposal technician and the destruction of a facility that could be rebuilt. The recognition brought no anger or resentment, only a kind of clarity about my position in the Imperium's vast machinery, about the way individuals were evaluated and expended in service to larger strategic objectives. I began the neutralization sequence, working with the careful precision that the procedure demanded, each movement deliberate, each action verified before proceeding to the next step. The device responded to my manipulations exactly as my analysis had predicted, its systems disengaging in sequence, the deadly potential it contained gradually being rendered inert through systematic deconstruction. I felt something like triumph as I disconnected the final triggering circuit, as I confirmed through multiple verification procedures that the device was now completely safe, that I had succeeded in the task that had seemed nearly impossible hours before. I was reporting my success to Kursk, describing the device's final configuration for the record, when I noticed the additional component that my earlier analysis had somehow missed. It was hidden beneath the primary explosive package, shielded from Auspex examination by the bulk of material above it, a small secondary device that had remained dormant until some condition was met. I had perhaps 3 seconds to understand what I was seeing: a completely independent triggering system, unconnected to the mechanisms I had just neutralized, a final trap designed to kill the disposal technician at the moment of their apparent success. The detonation was smaller than the main device would have produced, but it was sufficient at close range, the blast force catching me fully, my armor offering no protection against explosive energy applied from underneath where the ceramite plates were thinnest. I felt the impact as sudden pressure and heat, felt my body being torn apart by forces that my nervous system couldn't properly process, felt the transition from being to becoming something other than human, something that retained consciousness for a fractional moment beyond what should have been possible. In that final instant, I understood that everything I had feared was true. The duty consumed everyone it touched. The skills and training only delayed an outcome that was always inevitable. The Imperium's machinery ground through individuals, without regard for their worth or sacrifice. I understood that my death would be catalogued and filed, and forgotten, that another candidate would be selected and trained and deployed to take my position, that the cycle would continue until either the enemy was defeated or the Imperium itself collapsed under the weight of its own entropy. I understood that I had served faithfully despite knowing this truth, that faith in the Emperor and loyalty to humanity had sustained me even when hope was absent, that this service was its own justification regardless of its outcome or cost. The pain ended before understanding did, my consciousness fragmenting into pieces that could no longer sustain coherent thought, dispersing into darkness that was neither peaceful nor terrible, but simply absent of all quality. In the final dissolution, there was a moment that might have been acceptance, or might have been recognition that I had lived and served and died according to the patterns ordained for those who take up this duty, that my sacrifice was meaningful even if unremarked, that I had stood between the innocent and the heretic's wrath for as long as flesh and will permitted. They would file reports about my death, analyze the device that killed me, perhaps learn lessons that would save some future technician from the same fate. Or perhaps they would learn nothing. Perhaps the heretics would evolve faster than the Imperium could adapt. Perhaps the next technician would face the same trap and make the same fatal error of believing that success was achieved when the enemy's final trick remained unrevealed. It ceased to matter. In the end, the duty continued. The war continued. The Imperium's machinery continued to process new candidates into this specialized function, and somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the administratum, my name would be struck from active rosters and recorded in lists of the fallen. One more entry among millions, one more servant who had given everything in defense of a civilization that would forget him before his body finished cooling in the facility's flooded chamber. This is what I remember, what I understood in those final moments before dissolution. This is the testimony I would offer if consciousness survived death. If there were any witness to receive it, I served faithfully. I faced the duty without flinching. I died as so many died before me, and as many more will die after, in a war that has no ending and admits no victory, only the continuation of service until flesh fails and consciousness extinguishes, and nothing remains but the cold equations of the Imperium's eternal mathematics.